I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land in which we're meeting and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. Welcome to everybody here to ASPI, our final public event for 2024. Gee, what a year it's been for international security. Unfortunately, I should probably say international insecurity. We, of course, have war in Europe. We've got war through the Middle East. We've got where, of course, we've just seen the demise of the Assad regime in Syria. We're also grappling with increasingly aggressive behaviour by China throughout this region, the South China Sea, and in relation to Taiwan. And the reality of all these threats is that geographic distance no longer spares any country. All of these threats and conflicts and tensions impact Australia, and they impact the Euro-Atlantic, which means the relationship between Australia and our friends throughout Europe, particularly those in NATO, is only becoming more important. It's these partners and friends within NATO that most closely align with and share Australia's principles, in particular to uphold and enforce international rules and laws. And it's why it's such a pleasure to be joined tonight by Ambassador Boris Ruge, NATO's Assistant Secretary General for Political Affairs and Security Policy. Ambassador Ruge leads the team responsible for political affairs within NATO's international staff, which includes partnerships, policy on Russia, as well as arms control, disarmament, and non-proliferation. And from September until recently, the ambassador was serving as Acting Deputy Secretary General. And tonight we'll hear Ambassador Ruge's view of European security, the future of NATO under the new Secretary General, and why the relationship with Indo-Pacific countries, including Australia and our IP4 friends, is vital for the security of both our regions. We only have to look at what's happened this week in Syria to see how everything is connected and how security decisions in one region impact all other regions. It's highly unlikely that, or it's highly likely rather, that we wouldn't have seen the same speed of the demise of the Assad regime in Syria if Iran and Russia had not been so degraded, in Iran's case by Israel, and of course in Russia's case by the resilience of Ukraine and the support, the ongoing support of NATO and other nations. And those implications are not just relevant for the Middle East. The collective support we are showing for Ukraine's defence of its territorial integrity against Russia is also a vital lesson for us to take here in the Indo-Pacific, and hopefully a clear sign that aggressive larger powers can't just impose their will on smaller powers. So to delve into these issues, I'd like to invite Ambassador Ruge to provide some opening remarks before his conversation with ASPI's own Euan Graham, our Acting Head of Defence Strategy. And we'll also make sure there is time for questions from you here. And for those, I know there's a large listening audience. So if you have any questions throughout tonight's event, send them through and we'll see if a few of them can be answered. But thank you very much. Once again, I would like to recognise, as I should have at the very beginning, all of our ambassadors who are in the room. It is absolutely fabulous to see you and your support here. And a shout out to ASPI's chair, Gabe Rotman. Wonderful to see you here as well. But Ambassador Ruge, over to you.
Many thanks for your kind words, Justin. And it's an honor and a pleasure to be here at ASPI. If what I say this evening is less than coherent, I will blame it on my jet lag. Having arrived in Australia yesterday, I have newfound respect for my Australian colleagues who come to Brussels for consultations, and also for your leaders who turn up for our NATO summits and ministerials. And speaking of respect, let me say this up front. We at NATO are very proud of our partnership with Australia. Australian troops fought alongside NATO forces in Afghanistan. Since 2022, you have truly stepped up in supporting Ukraine against Russia's full-scale invasion. And you are now helping us understand the dynamics here in the Indo-Pacific that, as Justin has just pointed out to us, increasingly impact our security in the Euro-Atlantic area. So many thanks for all that to the government of Australia, and more specifically to Deputy Secretaries Ellie Lawson and Hugh Jeffrey, my counterparts in the NATO-Australia strategic dialogue that we conducted earlier today. Ladies and gentlemen, it's perhaps useful to remind ourselves of what NATO represents today. As you know, we celebrated our 75th anniversary at the Washington Summit in July. For its first 40 years, over the entire course of the Cold War, from 1949 to 1989, NATO was all about collective defense in the confrontation with the Soviet Union and the Warsaw Pact. It was thanks to NATO that our democracies were able to hold their own in that confrontation. In the post-Cold War era, from the 1990s onward, we were afforded what might be called a holiday from history. Russia no longer posed a threat. Collective defense ceased to be the central purpose of our alliance. Instead, NATO, along with the European Union, played a key role in expanding the zone of stability in Europe by enlarging, and it played a role in expeditionary operations in the Balkans and in Afghanistan. During that time, a great deal of effort was invested in building partnerships. And there was no partnership into which we invested more than into that with Russia. Based on the NATO-Russia Founding Act of 1997 and embodied in the NATO-Russia Council, there was an enormous array of activities and dialogue. Many have forgotten this, but it is important to remember the investment undertaken by NATO to shape a positive relationship with Russia. That post-Cold War era finally and irrevocably came to an end with Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022. The writing was on the wall much before that, but February 2022 made clear to all allies that partnership with Putin's Russia was not possible. In the words of the strategic concept adopted in June of 2022, the Russian Federation is the most significant and direct threat to allies' security and peace and stability in the Euro-Atlantic area. In other words, collective defense once again became the core business of our alliance, which soon added Finland and Sweden as members. Today, we face a very challenging strategic environment. Russia's economy is relatively small, but Russia's economy and its society have essentially moved to a war footing. And the spending of the Russian Federation is now approximately 1/3 of its national budget, corresponding to something in the order of 8% of GDP. And Russia is, of course, supported by a number of enablers, most importantly, China, but also the DPRK, about which more in a moment. At the Washington Summit in July, NATO heads of state and government identified 3 priorities which our new Secretary General, Mark Rutte, has embraced when taking office in October. First, strengthening our deterrence and defense. Secondly, bolstering support to Ukraine for the long term. And finally, deepening NATO's partnerships. Let me say a few words about each of these 3 priorities. First, on deterrence and defense, NATO in 2022 and 2023 decided on a new set of defense plans. The task we now face is to provide the necessary forces, capabilities, resources, and infrastructure to make those plans executable. Doing so requires increased defense spending. The good news is that 23 allies are now at 2% of GDP defense spending or above. The bad news is that 9 allies are not yet there. And the bad news is also that 2% will not nearly be enough to deliver what is needed. Over the weekend, I had a look at West Germany's defense spending during the Cold War. People sometimes talk about 3% as being the yardstick during that period. In fact, West Germany consistently spent above 4% from 1959 through 1967, with no less than 5.2% being spent in 1963. And from 1968 onward, until the very last years of the Cold War, defense spending remained consistently above 3%. It is clear that significantly more than 2% will be needed on the part of NATO allies in order for our alliance to be credible in terms of its deterrence and defense. And you can expect Secretary General Rutte to push hard for the necessary increases. Another aspect on which the Secretary General is very much focused is defense industry. He's working hard with governments and with industry in order to increase production capacity, so added defense spending turns into military capabilities and much faster than has been the case so far. This is an area where cooperation between NATO and the European Union will be key, and it is also an area for potential cooperation between NATO and the IP4. Without significant increases in the capacity of our defense industrial base, we will not be able to provide our own armed forces with the necessary capabilities. That takes me to the second priority, which is bolstering support to Ukraine. At the Washington summit, we took a number of decisions to put support for Ukraine on a long-term basis, including the creation of a new NATO command, NSATU, to which Australia is providing personnel, for which we are extremely grateful. Last week, we had our foreign ministerial meeting, and the Secretary General highlighted the need to keep Ukraine supplied so it can stay in the fight. The Biden administration has committed to pushing out everything that has been authorized by the US Congress by the 20th of January. European allies and Canada must similarly step up, and many are doing so. Of course, Australia too has played an important role, most recently by announcing delivery of M1A1 main battle tanks to Ukraine, and that is on top of very significant deliveries. There's no doubt that Ukraine faces a very tough situation now, both on the front line and in terms of Russia's ongoing air campaign, terrorizing the civilian population and targeting the country's energy infrastructure. But Ukraine will be able to stay in the fight with our support and to emerge from the war as a sovereign and independent nation, able to exercise its own choices, including joining NATO. The reason we are providing these unprecedented levels of support is, of course, to bring an end to the war, not to prolong it. But ending the war must happen on terms that are acceptable to Ukraine, not by way of unconditional surrender to Mr. Putin. The third priority area is deepening NATO's partnerships. One reason for this is that security increasingly needs to be understood in global rather than in regional terms. To be sure, NATO will remain a defensive alliance covering the Euro-Atlantic area. We are not coming to the Indo-Pacific. But we are facing threats and challenges from other parts of the world into the Euro-Atlantic area. The DPRK, North Korea, has sent troops to fight alongside Russia. China is present in our critical infrastructure. It has engaged in economic coercion against members of NATO. Cyber attacks have been attributed by NATO nations to PRC actors. In the words of NATO's 2022 strategic concept, the PRC's stated ambitions and coercive policies challenge our interests, security, and values. Most recently, Beijing has become a decisive enabler of Russia's war against Ukraine, despite its claims of neutrality. And therefore, the message to China in our Washington summit declaration was this, and I quote, "The PRC cannot enable the largest war in Europe in recent history without this negatively impacting its interests and reputation." In other words, China cannot violate our core interests in the Euro-Atlantic area without suffering consequences. Partnerships help us navigate this increasingly complex and connected global security landscape. And our partnership with Australia is at the top of the list in terms of substance and in terms of the quality of our dialogue. Your Prime Minister and most recently Deputy Prime Minister Marles have attended 3 NATO summits in a row. Your ministers and senior officials have been present at countless meetings. In October, we had our first defense ministerial meeting with Australia and the other IP4 partners at the table. Our partnership with Australia is based on the so-called ITPP, the Individually Tailored Partnership Program, which covers 13 areas, including resilience, cyber, operations preparation and training, logistics, space, as well as women, peace, and security. So our partnership is not just focused on China. And while it is based on the bilateral program between NATO and Australia, dialogue often involves Australia engaging NATO alongside Japan, New Zealand, and the Republic of Korea, i.e. in the IP4 format. So there are the Secretary General's priorities for you: strengthening deterrence and defense, bolstering support for Ukraine, and deepening our partnerships. One more issue has been a priority for Mark Rutte in recent weeks, and that is engaging President-elect Trump and his incoming administration. The Secretary General had an early phone call following the US elections, and he was able to meet Mr. Trump in Mar-a-Lago on 22 November. Given that the US is and remains the backbone of our alliance, it was important to reach out early on, building on the good relationship that Mark Rutte and Mr. Trump had developed previously. We are well aware of the debate on the future of US foreign policy within the Republican Party. And we are also aware of the special responsibilities that the United States has in this part of the world. But we are confident that we can adapt NATO to the realities of the 2020s and beyond, with European allies and Canada stepping up. And not to forget, with a little help from our friends here in Australia, who have much to teach us. So thank you very much for your attention. I look forward to our discussion.
Thanks very much, Ambassador Ruge. You betrayed no signs of jet lag in that presentation.
Not yet.
So congratulations on that. You also preempted a lot of the questions that were on my sheet of paper to give to you, including a very clear steer on the new Secretary General's priorities. So I don't have to do that. And you also talked a little bit about the incoming US administration, which is obviously going to be seen, I think, very clearly as a priority, but not necessarily all as a challenge. And maybe just to ask you to expand a little bit on your comments there. In what sense does it actually pose an opportunity for NATO?
The new US administration?
Yes.
So I think we can safely predict that President-elect Trump will push European allies and Canada very hard on defense spending. And this is not something that Mr. Trump has come up with. It is a long-standing demand on the part of the United States, put forward by Democratic and Republican administrations alike. But Mr. Trump has put it forward in more robust terms, perhaps, than some of his predecessors. And the reality is that we face a strategic context that is supremely challenging. And I've tried to describe it. A hyper-aggressive Russia that has put its economy and its society on a war footing, and that is spending a third of its national budget on defense. And if you translate that into purchasing power parity, what the bang that the Russians get for their ruble, that's a lot of defense spending right there. So we have a huge challenge cut out. And at the same time, the United States for essentially 2 decades has been talking about pivoting to Asia, rebalancing to the Indo-Pacific. And time and again, it has been it has had to engage in Europe and the Middle East and to play its role as the ultimate security guarantor. But I think we're coming to the end of the line of this. And I think there's just no alternative. And this is a message that I think you will hear very loud and clear from Secretary General Rutte for European allies and Canada to step up now. We've made a great deal of progress. We have 23 allies at 2% or above. We have some allies like Poland above 4%. We have the Baltic states spending around about 3% or above. So, there's a real sort of spread between the 32 NATO allies. But the bottom line is most of us will have to do more in order to resource our defense plans and in order to allow for a rebalancing to some extent of responsibilities within the alliance.
You talked also about the Secretary General's commitment to international engagement in this region. We'll turn to that maybe a little bit later in the conversation, but that was a good marker, at least. And as you referenced in your remarks, you were actually here for the formal Australia NATO engagement as part of that. Before that, let's just keep our focus on Europe. We look obviously with considerable unease at the situation in Ukraine, even from this distance in Australia. But elsewhere in Europe, there's been a noticeable uptick in sabotage attacks of critical infrastructure in Europe, which have been identified with Russia. And there is obviously a commonality of risk for countries like Australia as we look at how NATO has responded to that. In your view, how well equipped are NATO's members to face this threat? Have they met their obligations and requirements under Article 3 of the treaty? And how well is NATO postured to respond to this growing incidence of hybrid threats?
I think it's important to strike a balance when we look at this Russian hybrid campaign. It features in the Washington summit declaration. There's an entire paragraph describing Russia's hybrid campaign, which goes all the way from disinformation, cyber attacks, to sabotage. But we must not credit Russia with each and every incident that could fall in this category. We must not exaggerate its potential. What we can see is that there's risk-taking and recklessness on the part of Russia. There has been a response typically at the national level. Then there has been coordination beginning with information sharing at the NATO level. We have a number of new instruments in place, for example, a Center for Critical Undersea Infrastructure at the Maritime Command of NATO. So I think we are equipping ourselves at the national level and at the NATO level to respond to these kinds of attacks. But of course, some of them require that we catch up and become better in resilience. And of course, this is, as you say, founded in Article 3 of the North Atlantic Treaty that calls on NATO nations to undertake the preparations to be able to defend against external threats. In my mind, the most important thing we can do in order to counter this Russian hybrid campaign is to maintain our strong support to Ukraine, because Mr. Putin's campaign has a purpose. The purpose is to undermine stability in various NATO nations, but even more to persuade us to lessen our support to Ukraine or to end our support to Ukraine. And that is a favor that we will not do for Mr. Putin. So that will continue. And the more we maintain that support or even step up, the more Russia's campaign will have been a failure.
It's a clear answer, but do you think that the NATO members have found the requisite balance in terms of resourcing the need for conventional defense, which has come back with a vengeance for the reasons you outlined, the need to provide assistance to Ukraine? Has that come at the expense in some cases of building up civil defense infrastructure in the member states themselves?
So resilience is a national responsibility. It is something that is an issue at the NATO level, but it is first and foremost a national responsibility. And it is true that in the 3 decades since the end of the Cold War, civil defense infrastructure has been has deteriorated in many places. One place where it has not deteriorated is Finland. I was in Helsinki 2 months ago. It's very impressive what they have in terms of a civil defense infrastructure. The reason they had that was that they were out there on their own, living with a very problematic neighbor. So again, there's also catch up to do in that regard, no doubt.
And we've had recent visitors, both from Finland and Sweden. So it bears out your point that the learning experience has actually been enriched by the enlargement process. Absolutely. To those countries.
Absolutely.
You talked also about the indivisibility of the European and Indo-Pacific theatres, and you mentioned you didn't pull back from saying that both China and North Korea had been enablers. North Korea in a very direct sense, but China also clearly there, providing economic assistance and more to Russia's war effort. So I think it's been brought home again with a vengeance that the indivisibility is not necessarily Europe doing more in Asia. Asia is also making its presence felt uncomfortably through the authoritarian countries in Europe. But we've also seen, I think, an uptick here in European engagement, not all of which has come through a European lens. The traditional expeditionary partners here are the UK and France. France, which has territories in this part of the world, so their presence is already priced in and a part of the engagement. But frankly, I would never have predicted that we would have had, for example, an Italian carrier group coming out to the Indo-Pacific, as we did earlier this year. We've had single deployments of German ships. Next year, we're told that there may be a Norwegian contribution to the UK carrier strike group. So that's been noted, but it comes in some senses rather pell-mell, not with an overarching European or NATO or even a national structure on that, which can make the engagement sometimes rather difficult to absorb because it's not coming in with an obvious coordination. To what extent, looking at your lens on how the European countries within NATO engage here, how much of that would you like to see coming under a NATO aegis, and how much would be still done on a national basis?
I think what you can expect, Euan, is for the most part these kinds of deployments to be done on a national basis, whether it's ships, aircraft, land forces coming here to exercise with Australia, other Indo-Pacific partners. I think that will be done on a national basis. What will be done on a NATO basis is political dialogue, working in the framework of the partnership programs that exist. What will be done on a NATO basis is Indo-Pacific partners, for example, coming to Europe to exercise with our armed forces. And then, of course, we have a mix. On the one hand, as I said, we have the partnership program with Australia, which is the framework between NATO and Australia. But at the same time, we have worked increasingly with the IP4 as a group. And I think that there's been very positive side effects of that for NATO, as well as for the IP4 as a group, I think. But I think the way we will continue to operate is that when it comes to deployments, to exercises in this part of the world, that you will see that being done on a national basis.
We're in Australia, obviously, but one of the other IP4 engagement initiatives that received a bit of media attention was the plan to establish an engagement office in Tokyo, in Japan, which, to my knowledge, is not eventuated yet. Do you have any update for us on that? Is that still part of your thinking? And is the receptivity equally there on the Japanese side?
Right. So that was something that was discussed back in 2023. And as you know, NATO operates on the basis of consensus. At the time, there was no consensus for this office to be established, and therefore it was put aside. Now, we have many opportunities and mechanisms to step up our engagement with the IP4. And the presence of a liaison office is not the only way to go about this. I think this is the kind of thing that might be taken forward when we can be sure that all 32 NATO allies will support it. If that is in doubt, then I think it is not something we will put on the table. But I think overall, the engagement with the IP4 has really grown in a significant way in terms of the quality. And again, 3 summits in a row with IP4 heads of state and government coming, ministerials for the first summit in October, defense ministerial with the participation of the IP4, and many engagements. The ROK briefing on the presence of DPRK troops in Ukraine. So there's really a greater frequency and more depth to these engagements and more substance to the practical cooperation that is going on.
You referenced already the Australian contribution in terms of military assistance in equipment, also training. I think New Zealand, although on a much smaller scale, has been part of that effort. Is there anything that the IP4 are not doing in Ukraine that you think they could usefully contribute in your discussions?
So first thing I would say is I think Ukraine is grateful and NATO is grateful for what the IP4 have done in a number of areas, whether it's political support, whether it is non-lethal support, whether it is military equipment. And what Australia has done in this regard is very remarkable. The fact that Australia is part of the new NATO command, NSATU, NATO security assistance and training to Ukraine, it's very significant that you have a presence there in a headquarters in Germany, designed to assist Ukraine with training and equipment support and logistics. That's a big deal. It means a lot. So, before I would be looking to IP4 partners to do more, I would be looking at certain NATO partners to be doing more, to be honest. Because what Australia has done is very significant, and we should be looking at our own allies before asking for any additional contributions. But what you've done is very much appreciated.
Okay, I think that's an appropriate time to put this out to the questions from the floor. We also have our online audience, so just to remind those. We already have a couple of questions in, but please send those in online. I do have access to them, and we'll come to them. But let's start, first of all, with a question from my colleague who needs no introduction because I know who you are, Alex Bristow. But for others, please, when you do get the microphone, if you could keep to one question only, please announce yourself as well.
Thanks, boss. You're not just colleagues, you're also my manager. But my name's Alex Bristow. I'm in a defence team here at ASPI. My question is whether NATO has done any planning about how it would react to a major war in this region, notably a war over the Taiwan Strait. My understanding of NATO's founding treaty is that there are strict geographic limitations on where Article 5 is active. But presumably, if North America were attacked in some way, then it's possible that NATO could be directly militarily involved. But even if it's not, would you expect NATO allies to be doing certain things in other domains, even if they're not directly militarily involved?
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much. So I think the first part of the answer is NATO is a defensive alliance that covers the Euro-Atlantic area. In that sense, what we would do in terms of deterrence and defense has a geographical limitation. So NATO would not play a role in this part of the world. But we could expect that individual allies, for example, allies who have treaty obligations in this part of the world, having to move resources, and that would have implications for NATO and our posture in Europe. And that just reinforces the point that that European allies must be ready to do more and to do more faster in order to have a posture in Europe that allows us to deal with our own security challenges. I think that would be the main point to make.
I saw the hand of my other colleague on the other side of the room, Malcolm Davis. Malcolm.
Hi, Dr. Malcolm Davis Aspie. When we look at Ukraine, one of the key features that we've seen is Russia willing to rattle nuclear sabers on a regular basis to move nuclear forces around to sort of make sort of very dangerous threats about use of tactical nuclear weapons. And it seems to be having an effect on NATO in terms of constraining their willingness to go too far in supporting Ukraine. And I think when you see the effect that that's happening, it must resonate with other potential threats out there, including China and North Korea, in terms of the potential to use tactical nuclear weapons or threats of tactical nuclear weapons to coerce and to intimidate. So I'd be interested to know where NATO thinking is going on how to respond to the reality that nuclear weapons, and in particular tactical nuclear weapons, are once again a key factor in planning in terms of the threat that we face. How does NATO plan on responding to nuclear intimidation, be it in Europe by the Russians, or be it in the Indo-Pacific region by China and North Korea?
So, several questions there, I think. The first point is Mr. Putin and others in the Russian government and people close to the regime have engaged for the past 3 years in irresponsible nuclear rhetoric and have attempted to intimidate us. And I think it's important. Recently, we had an adjustment in the Russian nuclear doctrine that was advertised. I think I can say that we follow these things very carefully. We try and analyze methodically what is being said, and we observe as best we can whether in terms of the posture there are any changes. I think Mr. Putin has been largely unsuccessful in stopping us from supporting Ukraine. And if you think back to February 2022, there was a level of military support to Ukraine, but a lot of this was about anti-tank weapons, right, and basic military equipment. And then, we had one discussion after another about certain weapon systems, howitzers, ATACMS, Storm Shadow, Scalp, fighter aircraft, F-16, and so on and so on. And time after time, Moscow said, well, this is something you must not do. This is a red line you must not cross. And we went ahead. NSATU, the new NATO command to support Ukraine, in a sense was also a kind of red line. For the first more than 2 years, NATO itself had stayed out of the business of playing a direct role in providing equipment and training. It was individual allies, it was the European Union doing this. We had the Ramstein format coordinating, but NATO itself didn't have this direct role. Now we have this direct role, right? And we've taken over some functions from the Support Assistance Group Ukraine and the IDCC, the sort of ad hoc structures, one of them US-led, that were originally created. So I would say we have not been deterred. And more recently, the Biden administration lifted restrictions on the use of ATACMS. The UK and France lifted restrictions on the use of Storm Shadow and Scalp. So we've crossed quite a few red lines. That doesn't mean that the existence of nuclear weapons, including tactical nuclear weapons, on the part of the Russian Federation is irrelevant. It is, of course, relevant, but I think we've crossed many red lines. We have supported Ukraine. We've kept them in the fight. And after almost 3 years of fighting, the mighty Russia has pretty much failed meeting its self-proclaimed war aims. Not even the annexation is annexed 4 regions of Ukraine, but it does not control the entirety of those 4 regions. And it is far from having toppled the government of President Zelensky and taken control of Kiev. So I think we've done pretty well. But I think I would underline that we analyze carefully what Russia says and does in this domain. No doubt about it.
I'm going to weave in some of the online questions that I've received, starting with a question from Mary, who says that NATO announced this week that it was establishing a new cyber command center in Europe. I don't know whether that's the case or not, but Mary says there is a strong case for such a NATO command equivalent command to be established in this region, and has suggested that Australia would be an ideal candidate for this. I don't know whether that mirrors your conversations with Ellie Lawson and Hugh Jeffrey earlier on today, but we haven't talked about cyber yet. Perhaps in terms of flattening the geographical landscape, cyber is an obvious case in point. What are the mutual lessons to be learned, and is there anything practically that NATO could contribute in this region in terms of its cyber best practice?
So obviously, this is an area where geography is entirely irrelevant, and as I mentioned in my statement, a number of NATO nations have attributed cyber attacks to the PRC or PRC actors. So distance is irrelevant in this regard. Cyber is an important part of the conversation between NATO and Australia. Australia recently hosted a cyber event with NATO participation. So that there's a great deal that we can learn from you, I think. There's a lot that we can share. And again, this is an area where at the national level, at the NATO level, we need to build and strengthen our defenses against very, very aggressive actors.
Rishi asks about Sweden and Finland, which we've already touched on. They were long part of the JEF, which I understand was the Joint Expeditionary Force, if I've got that acronym right. Is their joining NATO more of a de jure confirmation of an existing de facto position?
And the answer to that is no. Sweden had more than 200 years of neutrality. Finland had, roughly 70 plus years of neutrality after World War II. Both of these countries were members of the European Union, but in the face of a hyper-aggressive Russia that not only invaded Ukraine in the form of this full-scale invasion, coming on top, of course, of the first invasion that happened in 2014. Not enough with that, Russia, in the run-up to the full-scale invasion, basically demanded a roll back of NATO to pre-enlargement. And that's, I think, when people in Sweden and Finland decided that this was the time to join the alliance. And that makes a big difference. Sweden and Finland were, I think, really our closest partners as European countries. Very familiar with NATO, very capable armed forces. But being part of NATO and coming under Article 5 and thereby coming under extended nuclear deterrence is a different story. So that's what they opted for. And so Mr. Putin, I think, can credit himself for bringing about this significant reorientation of the foreign and security policy of these two nations. Congratulations on that.
Gentleman in the second row with the glasses.
Yeah, thank you. Andreas Rutte, I represent FES, a German political foundation linked to the Labour Party.
Yeah.
And incidentally, FES colleagues in Bangkok just a couple of weeks ago hosted a workshop that was entitled The Geopolitics of the Three Theatre World. I'm just mentioning that we've already talked about the interlinkages between the Euro-Atlantic theater and the Indo-Pacific, and you've spelled out what NATO is all about. NATO also has southern neighbors. We've had some very momentous things happening over the last couple of days, really, with the toppling of the Assad regime. I would just be interested to hear to what degree that also comes into the NATO calculations, seeing that the most important NATO member is involved in all these three theaters in ways that are interlinked and relevant. And then, of course, also Turkey as a NATO member is a key player in that
Absolutely.
area.
Yeah. Absolutely. So at the Washington Summit, our leaders endorsed something called Southern Neighborhood Action Plan. And part of that was creating a new position of a special representative of the Secretary General for the Southern Neighborhood. So we are well aware that what happens in North Africa, in the Sahel, in Sub-Saharan Africa, and in the Middle East, in the Gulf region in particular, has enormous impacts on European security. And of course, Syria would be a case in point. I spent quite a few years working on the region and in the region. If you think back to 2015 and the influx of enormous numbers of refugees, that was an immediate fallout of the war, the civil war in Syria, and other conflicts in the region. So we need to pay attention. We need to reach out and engage with these partners in the southern neighborhood in a sort of in a more active, more proactive way than we've done so far. I think the reality is that from 2014 onward, NATO was very focused on Ukraine and on the deteriorating relationship with Russia and the need to build up our deterrence and defense. And perhaps we didn't invest quite enough into these relationships with the southern neighborhood. It's partly sometimes a question of bandwidth. Now we're trying to remedy that, and that includes making better use of the NATO ICI regional center that we have in Kuwait, which sort of engages primarily with partners in the Gulf. It involves creating a new NATO liaison office in Amman, Jordan. And I think the starting point is really a more intensive level of political dialogue. And then in part it is working with individual partners who are looking to develop their defense establishments, their armed forces, providing defense capacity building support, and being more credible in that way. And that's a question, again, of bandwidth and of resources. So this is very much on the agenda, and I think we'll be able to do a better job. The King of Jordan was in Brussels just last week to brief the North Atlantic Council, not just on the situation in the Palestinian territories and in Lebanon, but for a broader picture. And Syria already featured in that briefing.
And NATO also supports the increased defence spending of Turkey as a member state, as it would any other member.
Of course, and Turkey, of course, is a key player in that region, and strategically important for us.
The ambassador of Lithuania in the front row.
Well, thanks a lot. Excellent discussion. So, Ambassador from Lithuania, Darius Zagutis. So, we are part of the good allies of NATO.
You are, absolutely.
We have a conscription. Our defense is 3.2% to defense this year. Next year, 3.5%. German brigade is coming, so we are good guys. But well, thanks a lot for what you have been discussing, and we know that. You do have very good relations. NATO has an excellent relation with the IP4 countries. You touched on the number of different partnership program elements, what you're doing and what you will be doing later on. We also know, and you've been telling that North Korea is sending troops to Russia. China is also very actively involved in trying to be involved in the critical infrastructure of our NATO allies in Europe. You probably know that the Chinese vessel cut the cable from Lithuania to Sweden, from Finland to Germany. So there was yet another, Chinese vessel which cut the cable half a year ago, the pipeline from Finland to Estonia. So yes. Well, we understand that you have an excellent relation with Australia. NATO is doing this, but you mentioned also that the liaison office in Tokyo was, in a way, not yet. Well, probably that should not be opened probably soon. So the question is: have you been discussing with any of the Australian officials to try to open a liaison office here in Canberra, for instance? Because I think it's very important what we need. All our European friends and all our European allies, we need to have a little bit of yes, we understand that we have embassies who represent NATO, but this representation office and liaison office, I think that would be good. Was there any ability, any possibility for you to discuss this kind of a question here in Australia? Thank you.
So right now we're not looking at creating a new NATO liaison office in this region. And before we sort of enter into those kinds of discussions, we would want to be sure that there's consensus at NATO on doing this. But the key point for me is deepening our partnerships in this region does not depend on having two people sitting in an office in Tokyo or Canberra. We're doing a lot of work, and our Australian partners, for example, turn up in Brussels on a very regular basis. And we have colleagues coming here. I think not so long ago, James Apatarai, who's our Deputy Assistant Secretary General for Innovation Hybrid Cyber, was here. So there's really a lot going on. I think that this is an option that could be looked at, but it is not stopping us from doing very good work. And just a word on Lithuania. Lithuania is indeed one of the good allies that has stepped up. But I would also say Lithuania is also one of the allies that is profiting from the solidarity of other allies. And the fact that Germany is putting a full brigade on a permanent basis in Lithuania is very significant. And the fact that air policing for Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia is being done by NATO allies is significant. So the solidarity is there. The presence on the eastern flank is there. In Latvia, it's Canada. In Estonia, it's the UK that is leading these multinational battle groups that can be scaled up to brigade size. But in Lithuania, we have the special case of the agreement being in place now for a permanent presence. And in a sense, as a German diplomat, I would say this is sort of our turn as Germans to step up. When Germany was divided, we had hundreds of thousands of Allied troops smack in the middle of Germany, defending us in a forward defense mode. And that is what Lithuania has asked for, and that is what you're getting. And that's great news.
Ambassador, I'd just like to take the privilege to ask you a final question, if I may. We've mentioned several times in passing the presence of North Korean troops, which is a truly wild card development. If you were to have been asked in 2020, what's your black swan? I don't think anyone would have predicted Ukrainian and North Korean forces fighting a ground battle in Kursk. It's truly extraordinary. War is the great accelerator. It's a wild tiger that people who start it, once they're on, they don't know where it will lead them. Either professionally or personally, and it's up to you. What's the element of the war in Ukraine that has surprised you most?
So I think I'll mention two things to start with. One was the gross incompetence of Russia's armed forces in starting this invasion. And then, of course, the remarkable ability of Ukraine's armed forces to resist. But you could add to that the learning that has taken place on the battlefield in Ukraine on both sides. So Russia's level of competence has grown, and we must not underestimate its capacity. It has done so at enormous cost to itself. Our estimate is currently that Russia is losing about 1,500 men per day killed and wounded on the front line in order to make these incremental gains. That's an astonishing number. And I don't believe that Russia will be able to maintain that level of human sacrifice in the long term. And I'm not sure what the life expectancy of these North Korean troops is, because they will be thrown into this fight as well, and their lives will be wasted to gain a few hundred meters or a few kilometers here and there. But again, I think the capacity of Ukraine to resist has been truly astonishing. The capacity of Ukraine to combine traditional equipment, traditional capabilities with cutting-edge technology, that's been very impressive. And the capacity of the society and the political system to resist this aggression, very, very remarkable. And if we continue to support them, they will be able to stay in the fight and to prevail as a sovereign and independent nation.
Well, that, I think, is a chastening note on which to end, but also an appropriate message. We wish you the very best from Australia in your professional endeavours to do just that, and also in your continuing engagement with the countries of the region, including the IP4. We thank you for your time and the fact that you've deflected the jet lag for the benefit of the audience. I hope you'll be able to get a good sleep tonight.
Thank you very much.
It just remains for me to thank the audience who are here in person for your questions and attention, those online who asked questions, apologies to those who I wasn't able to get around to, but most of all to Ambassador Ruge himself for your insight and your frankness. And we hope that this will not be the last time you visit us here in ASPI. We also can value our engagement as a think tank with NATO issues and NATO structures. And we'll try to take that forward in future.
Thank you very much, Euan. It's a pleasure.
Thank you.